I think that's the key, actually, is, I'm paying in extremis when saying get it for free. But the notion is that right now people, Chicago used to not charge people, they didn't have any metering systems, so they charged people a flat fee for the water they got no matter how much they used. And a lot of attention has been focused on meters for how much people use. And it may be that what we really want to meter, and this is another technology that can be developed here, and there's a company in Beechwood called Hexagon that does these kinds of meters. It may be that you want to meter and charge more on the stormwater runoff. As you and I were talking before, I learned over the course of the last year that we all know that sidewalks and driveways and roads and parking lots are not permeable. But our typical suburban lawns with Bermuda grass in them are not that much more permeable than concrete. And we put nitrogen on them when we put our fertilizer on. So one of the possible reasons we have the dead zone issue is because of our lawns. And if you had put in place policies, I'm not saying sticks, but sort of if you put in policies that encourage people, and may have some little carrot and stick mixed to it, encourage people to say it's going to cost you more for what runs off than for what you use, then you'll see more use of permeable concrete. You'll see more holding ponds. You'll see more marshland and wooded areas put in than green grass, much as we talked about when you and I both lived out on the West Coast.
Just not to interrupt you here, but I mean, could some of this be incorporated into something like the way we have LEED certified green buildings that like now not incorporate just things about the building itself that are ecologically friendly, but the landscaping around the building and the land use that the building sits on?
Well, it can. I mean, it's already being done in some places. I mean, when I first started practicing law, you didn't even have discussions about retention and detention, and now there's discussions about permeable type of even hard surfaces, like when you put a fire safety road where it actually grows grass, but it's got reinforcement underneath it. So I think there's been a lot of local movement in that direction. I still think looking at this, it's a question of how much is the public willing to pay. If you charge the developer of that shopping mall for the runoff, he's not going to pay it. It's going to get passed through to the rent, which is going to get passed through to the consumer. And the question is, at what price do we want to pay for this? I would rather see us looking more at the incentive program again, encouraging either through tax credits or allowing people a different, maybe increased use of their land in exchange for them being more progressive in some of the technology they're going to use to deal with the runoff. I like the carrot approach. I'm not big on the stick approach, and frankly, taxes is one of the reasons why Ohio is in the economic position we are today. It may be a national financial problem, but Ohio for the last 10 years has lagged behind some of our sister states like Indiana because business perceives our state as being too tax heavy to begin with. So when we have this weighing of the environmental concerns with the economic assets of our water, whether it's stormwater or Lake Erie water or groundwater, there is a tipping point where if you get too heavy on the one end, you're going to discourage the economic development end, which I think right now is a critical need in Northeast Ohio.
What about water rights, just because you're bringing up some of these issues, what about water rights of property in terms of, how do we look at it now? And I mean, do we need to look at it more like look at water more like air instead of a mineral that, if I am on my property, do I own the water that's there?
Well, that was the whole debate with the Great Lakes Compact. Ohio has been very interesting. Up until 30 years ago, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled that you own the water under your private property. Then the Supreme Court of Ohio changed its view to you had a right to the reasonable use of the water under your property, so that if you were on an aquifer and Chris was on an aquifer and I'm on an aquifer, we all have a reasonable use of that aquifer. But none of us own the full rights to the aquifer. There's actually a statute, 1521-17 of the Ohio Revised Code, which attempts to set out the criteria for what reasonable use means in the context of water rights. And it's a rather detailed set of considerations for courts to decide. And the courts generally then have to work out a disagreement between property owners who have a shared water right. When we did the Great Lakes Compact, the concern that I had is that the language seemed to create the possibility that what was once considered your private right to the reasonable use of your water would be lost, and that water underground, like the water in Lake Erie, would become what's called public trust water, which means it's owned by the state on behalf of the residents, no longer the right of the landowner. There's no doubt Lake Erie is public trust water, owned by the state on behalf of all of us. But the water under my property is still my private property right, to the extent I have a right to its reasonable use. We insisted before we passed the compact that we address that issue, and the voters last year overwhelmingly approved issue 3 on the ballot, which created Article 1, Section 19B of the Ohio Constitution, which now says in the Ohio Constitution that each one of us who are private property owners have a constitutionally protected right to the reasonable use of the water under our property. So today, that water under my property, I don't own it like I own my car, but I own the reasonable right of use to it. And I think that was the right step to take, so that before we passed the compact, we didn't interfere with that private property right.
I think it's time for us to take some questions from the audience, but maybe you want to respond quickly. It looked like you had something to say, or no? Or
just very quickly, the one challenge with that is that we are dealing with a system, and outside of Chicago, there was a town that claimed that the water, since their water source was polluted, they wanted to be grandfathered into the Basin Compact because really technically they were tapping into Lake Michigan because they drilled down and their water source was Lake Michigan. So I'm less interested in the ideology of it than I am in the pragmatical, practical aspects of it. And the rights issue, I think, gets us off the topic of the use issue.
And Chris, I don't disagree with that to a point, except the rights issue is paramount in that at the end of the day, if I don't have the right to use my property, then the use issue is academic. I mean, in the first instance, I have to have the right to use it. And the reason why this is important is that if I have a constitutionally protected right to the reasonable use of my water, and the government comes around and passes some overreaching regulation, I can sue the government to have that regulation declared invalid or to be compensated for the loss of my constitutionally protected right. If it's not a right, if it's a privilege, if it's the state owns this water because it's somehow connected to Lake Erie, and they tell me I can't use it anymore, I have no recourse at all. And that is a significant issue of property rights to those of us who like to have control of the water under our property.
It looks like I opened a Pandora's box here. So I'm going to turn it over to the questions.
Today at the City Club, we're listening to a special program with Senator Tim Grendell of Ohio's 18th District, Chris Varley, Generation Foundation Fellow for Sustainable Development at the Great Lakes Science Center, and moderated by Gretchen Cuda of WCPN. We'll return to our panelists in a moment for our traditional City Club questions. We encourage you to formulate questions now while we break for a few announcements. We welcome all of you here, especially those who are guests. We hope you'll join the City Club and become active in our ongoing civic dialogue. This Friday, April 24th at noon, our regular forum will feature the National Director of the Anti-Defamation League, Abraham Foxman. On Tuesday, April 28th, Charlize Lyles, former City Club member and author of Do I Dare Disturb the Universe? From the Projects to Prep School, will discuss her book about growing up in Greater Cleveland. Also, next week on Wednesday, April 29th, the City Club will host a panel on green jobs that will discuss regional training programs and initiatives. For more information about our programs, to make reservations, or order a tape of today's program, please call the City Club at 1-888-223-6786, or 216-621-0082, or visit our website, cityclub.org. Today we are joined by students from John Adams High School. Participation is made possible by a grant from the First Energy Foundation. Will you please stand and receive our welcome? We also would like to welcome guests at a table hosted by the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District. Thank you for joining us today. Now we would like to return to our speakers for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are Special Programs Committee Co-Chair Ellie Sullivan and Committee Member Sue Nelson. First question, please.